Today's stuff we're going to be learning is about Zarah, Daf, and Aleph. Today's stuff is sponsored by David and Mitzi Geffen in loving memory of Mitzi's brother, Dr. Dennis Locke, on his yahrzeit. He was a loving husband, father, uncle, and grandfather, a devoted physician, and had a love of learning Talmud. He is sorely missed. Today's stuff is sponsored by Rachel Bievsky and Michael Frankus in honor of their baby daughter, Avital Tamima, born on the 12th of Av, August 6th. She's already listening to Rav Meri Farber's podcast during feedings. They should grow up to love learning. Zchat Hashem. Okay, we're going to get started with we started with the Mishnah yesterday. We'll just quickly review the Mishnah. Boleshet shenichnesah le'ir, b'shat shalom chaviyot ptuchot asurot, stumot mutara, b'shat milchama elevelu mutara, lefi she'ein pnai lenaseh. We talked about a troop coming into a city, and we said if they come in during times of peace, we assume they're going to go and just take wine of the people and drink from it. And therefore, anything that's open, we're worried that they drank from. And again, if the worried they drank, what's the concern? That perhaps they remember the whole issue of yayin, nesech, how it works. You shake up the wine, right? They either put their hand in or perhaps put something else in. There's different ways that wine libations can happen, right? Normally we think of a libation as pouring on the ground. And obviously, if someone poured something on the ground in front of an idol, that would be forbidden. But here we're talking about the concern that maybe they just even did some other method of libation, of just mixing or, shaking. And there's different possibilities to exactly how they could do this. But however they could do this, we're concerned that they did it while they were drinking. Now, if they didn't have time to drink because they were busy with war, and who's got time to start drinking wine, then we're not worried at all. So in times of war, this is not a concern. Comes the Gemara and says, Ramini, this contradicts the source we learned in Ketubot. And it's a very difficult source, so I'm going to warn you. Okay? You probably remember it. Okay, a city is attacked and besieged. So besieged means, right, no one in, no one out. Kol kohanot shebetocha psulot. Kohanot here means anyone married to a kohen. Okay, you have to remember the halachot. If a woman, not this case, commits adultery with someone, so she's forbidden to go back to her husband, and she's forbidden to the person she committed adultery with. However, if the woman is raped, then that's not an issue. But a woman who's married to a kohen cannot be married to a woman who was raped, and therefore it's a very problematic issue. And therefore, if the woman was raped, or we assume here there's a presumption that all the women in the city were raped, and therefore cannot go back to their husbands. So this is, in and of itself, is a very serious sugya and very complicated. The Shulchan Aruch, I looked this up because, obviously it's a complicated issue. The Shulchan Aruch says, basically, in Even HaEzer, Siman Zayin, Seif Yud, you already see there's ways lahatir, okay? They talk about whether if there was some way she could have hidden somewhere in the city, if there was some way she could have gotten out and no one would have seen her, if, if the woman says, nothing happened to me, okay? So there's all sorts of ways that we can get around this. That's not our issue for today, and we happen to have quite a long daf. I don't want to spend too much time, but it's not as black and white as it looks, just so you know. But here, for our purposes, what's the issue? Like, they don't have time to drink wine, but they have time to rape women. Okay, it's unfortunately a sad reality. Rav Meri, nesech im pnai levo yesh pnai. Okay, yes, to drink wine or to offer libations, that they don't have time for. But to rape women, unfortunately, they have time for. And this is unfortunately a very hard sugya to be learning in these days. Okay, new Mishnah. Ha'umnim shel Yisrael sheshalach lehem ovei kochavim chavit shel yayin. Okay, I'm going to preface this whole next section. What we're going to learn the rest of today's stuff is all sorts of issues with interactions between Jews and non-Jews with wine in different directions. Okay, Jews selling wine to non-Jews, non-Jews giving wine to Jews as payment for something. Okay, different sugyot in those directions. And it's all based on the fact that one is not allowed to benefit from yayin nesech. Okay, it's not just forbidden for drinking, it's also forbidden for to benefit from, which means I can't get any benefit. So if someone pays me a salary in wine, I can't benefit from it. I can't even sell it back to someone else because that would be considered benefit. Now, why do I want to start with this? Because the Taz that we quoted yesterday actually made mention, I can't remember if I read the whole thing, I think I might have skipped this part, but he makes mention of this issue that I wanted to look into, and I looked into it a bit more, about that nowadays it's not forbidden b'hana'ah anymore. And basically, none of these halachot would be relevant today based on the psak of the Ramah. Okay, there happens to be a machloket about this. Not everybody agrees with what I'm going to say right now. But particularly in Ashkenazi countries in the time of the Rishonim, they were very lenient about this. Okay, and they basically said, okay, they're going to quote the Ramah, who's basically quoting this from the Torah, also in the name of the Rashbam and the Rosh and the Mordechai, different Rishonim in Ashkenaz, that Bisman nowadays, which is there nowadays, If these days people don't offer libations anymore, okay? So basically, in Ashkenaz, they were very mekel, and they said, therefore, we're only going to forbid it for drinking, not for benefiting. So benefit is already not forbidden anymore, according to the Ashkenazi poskim and according to what the Ramah says. So there happen to be others who disagree with this, but that is the mainstream Ashkenazi psak anyway about nesech, and then that makes all these sugyot irrelevant. I just want to point that out, okay? Because once the only issue here has something to do with drinking, this is all about benefit. So let's start. Mishna. Ha'umim shel Yisrael. Okay, if I work, I'm a uman, a craftswoman, I work, and I do work for a non-Jew. And they sent me back yayin nesech. Again, I don't know for sure they were nesech, but I assume. So they sent me back wine to pay me. I could say, listen, thanks for sending me wine. I don't want wine. Give me money instead. But if it already is in my domain, now this is a big question what it means. Okay, let's say he just delivers it to my house and I didn't even accept it. So if I didn't make an arrangement and say you could pay me in wine, then that's not really considered. Remember we learned this whole thing about chatzar shel adam koneh. We're actually going to come back to this later today also, so it's good to discuss now. It means if you put something in my possession, this came up majorly in Gitin, husband, right? The woman has to accept the get. If the husband puts it in her courtyard, it's as if it's hers. She received it. So chatzar shel adam koneh. But not if, okay, this is not an issue for get, okay, let's put the get issue aside. Let's say it's a kinyan. I want to acquire something because get has a whole other complicated element of something else that I don't want to get into right now. But if you put something in my property, like this happens all the time now, right? People deliver things, they stick it, right? It's yours. It's a good question, like with Amazon, right? You claim it didn't come. I mean, now they take pictures and they kind of prove it came, but you can imagine this issue coming up. Once it's in your reshut, it's in your reshut, but not if I didn't agree to it. Like, I don't know if you know this, but I get these messages all the time in Israel. We're bringing a delivery. Can I leave it outside your house? Let me know. Or do I have to? Because it's a responsibility issue. Just because you left it out. If I didn't give you permission to leave it outside my house is going to be koneh. So, if I didn't agree to get the wine and you stuck it in my yard, that's not going to be considered that it was nifnasal b'shutin. If I say to you, listen, take it back, I want money, that's fine. But if I agreed, let's say, for some reason, by mistake, I didn't realize this was an issue. I just didn't think about it. And then I agreed, and then I realized, oh, I don't want it. I can't give it back anymore. Why not? Because it's already mine, okay? Whether I took it into my house, right? And then, even if I didn't agree, as long as I take it into my house, I've accepted it. Or you stuck it in my yard, and my yard was koneh, okay, whatever it might be. At that point, I can't say I want money instead, because it's mine. And now I'm basically trading yayin nesech for money. I'm benefiting from yayin nesech. That's the problem. So it has to be done before I accept it. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. In the Gemara now comes Rav and he says, Mutar la'adam. Okay, let me go back because I see you're asking Art, which is what? There's no profit. What's the benefit? There is profit because I got paid for my work in wine. I accepted the wine, so now the wine is mine. Now I have yayin nesech in my property. And when I say to you, listen, it was a mistake. I didn't want to get wine. I wanted money. I'm now trading. I'm getting benefit because right now I have something that to me is worth zero. And if I make it worth money now, because I'll trade it, it's worth something. So that's the benefit. The benefit is that at this point, it's mine. Once it's mine, I'm now trading yayin nesech for something else, and I can't do that. The benefit is the money I'm going to get in place of it. Make sense now? Okay. So now we're going to move to the Gemara. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, there was a tax that people would often pay in wine. You didn't have to, but you could. Now, if I say to my fellow non-Jew, can you pay it for me and I'll pay you later? Can you pay the tax? You can pay it in yayin nesech, okay? And that's not considered I benefit, even though I obviously benefited. But I didn't tell you to pay with yayin nesech, and you could have paid with wine, with money. So therefore, the fact that this non-Jew, this non-Jew decided to pay it in wine doesn't affect me. That was their decision, not my decision. But now they bring a difficulty. It says here in a different source, you can't say to an oved kochavim, you take my place to the tax collector and you pay the money, you pay. Now, here I don't even say money or wine, but if I say, you take my place to pay, and you pay in wine, I'm benefiting from that, and I can't do it. Now, why? Isn't that the same? So Amar le Rav says to support himself, because they questioned him, Kamal, that's not the same thing. Halo danya elalaha. My case is not similar to that. Why not? Ultachtay means you take my place completely. It's like a shaliach. I mean, there's a whole sugya about, is there shlichut for goyim or not? That's not going to be my question right now. Okay, can non-Jews, right, be a messenger for me? Is there agency? But not even talking about that. If I say, forget technical shlichut, halachic shlichut. If I say, take my place, then you're basically doing it as if it's me, which means it's as if you're giving me the wine and I'm giving it to the authorities. So that doesn't work. That's a different language than I used before, though, Rav is saying. What's more similar to me is Amar lo malteni min ha'otzer. If I say, save me from the tax, meaning, right, pay it for me, but not take my place, but can you save me, do me a favor? And they decide to pay in wine, that's their decision. I'll pay them back in money. It's not like I'm getting direct benefit. So this is all about what is benefit, what isn't benefit, and also the language you use. New Mishna. This is going to be a Mishnah. I'm going to give you the structure of what we're going to do. This is the complicated part of today's stuff. We're going to have a Mishnah that's not really so clear. We're going to talk about acquiring, when there's a kinyan, really. This is back to kinyanim. So normally, let's give some real background. With a Jew, if we have an interaction, Jew and Jew, I go buy something, and I give you money, and I don't get the object yet, I can change my mind. You can change your mind at any point. That's not a sale. Normally, we think that giving the money is the sale, not in halacha. It's mashicha, hagbaha, masira, some sort of action that I accept the item. If I haven't accepted the item, if I accepted the item and didn't give money, it's a done deal. No one can change their mind, even though I haven't paid yet. Okay? That's usually what does it. There's a whole bit machloket about mashicha kone or kesef kone by a non-Jew. And there's differences. I'm not going to get into all this because we'll never get off today's stuff. But chloket rish lakish or Rabbi Yochanan about ma'o konom and atuan. There's different strashot there. It's just kanomi adamitecha from their fellow Jew, and for non-Jews perhaps it's different. So we're not going to really get into that sugya, like the whole Mashiach Koneh for Jews and all that, but we're going to have a big debate here in the Gemara. I want to point out first, in the Gemara, between Amemar and Rav Ashi, whether Mashiach is a valid form of acquisition for a non-Jew or not. Okay, when we're doing an interaction with a non-Jew, if there's Mashiach as a Koneh or not. Okay, and we're going to see their sources and why each one says it works, and one says it doesn't work. Okay? Now, the Mishnah is going to be a little unclear, and we're going to start with the Mishnah. Okay, we're going to have where it seems like it's not clear whether it's Mashicha or money. It seems like there's some other issue that's Koneh that kind of makes things a done deal. And then we're going to leave the Mishnah. We're going to get into Amemar and Rav Ashi, and only at the very end of the daf, when they're going to raise the difficulty on Rav Ashi from our Mishnah. And then we're going to explain our Mishnah, both according to Amemar and according to Rav Ashi, and whether Mashicha or not Mashicha is Koneh. Okay, so we're going to have to have patience till we properly understand the Mishnah. So now we get to what I mentioned before. I was talking about the Rishonim, about selling wine. It's complicated to sell wine to non-Jews, and you'll see why. Now, the way they would sell wine, you come to a store, you want to buy the wine. Okay, either we'd agree on a price or wouldn't agree on the price. We'll see right now 2 cases. And then the Jew would take their barrel, they'd pour it into a jug. Okay, we're going to get into, is it the jug of the Jew, the non-Jew? Okay, that's a different story. Like, do you bring your own bottle or, bring your own jug, or is it from the store? And, obviously it could be both, right? Depends on where you are and who you are and whether you brought it or didn't bring it. So basically, we have someone who sells wine to a non-Jew. Pasak means we agreed on a price. Now that's an issue we didn't talk about yet, okay, in kinyanim. That's where it's going to get a little complicated. Why is Pasak the key point here? Because that's what's going to be important here. We made an arrangement that the wine was going to cost $100. Ad shalom madad, before we measured. Dami mutarim. Then I measure, meaning I pour it into the jug. And then what's going to happen? Okay, so then the point is, the kinyan is done already before the non-Jew gets the wine. When the non-Jew takes the wine, then basically they're taking the wine, they can do libations, they can do whatever they want. The deal is done even if I haven't gotten my money yet. When I get paid later, at least that's how we think the Mishnah reads, okay, let's just leave it at that. When I get paid later, I'm not benefiting from any yayin nesech. If they turned the wine later on into yayin nesech before I paid, it doesn't matter because it's in their possession already. However, madada chala pasak, if we never agreed on a price and I just poured out the wine, gave him the wine, and then later he was going to pay me, later we'd agree on a price and later the buyer would pay, I cannot benefit because what's the problem? It's still mine. As long as we haven't arranged a price and I haven't gotten paid, assuming I haven't gotten paid, okay, we're going to get back to this, but assuming I haven't gotten paid, then when they take it and turn it into yayin nesech potentially, and then I get paid for it later, I'm benefiting from the wine was still technically mine. It could be technically in his domain, but it's mine because I haven't sold it yet. So the sale hasn't gone through, and therefore, when I get my money, I'll be benefiting from yayin nesech. So that's a problem. Okay, we're going to put the Mishna aside, and now we're going to go to Amemar Rav Ashi, and we'll come back to it. Amar Amemar, Mashicha bovei kochavim koneh. It does work. How do I know it works? Now, what's acquiring all about? What someone's intention is really. So he says the following: Teda, I'll show you my proof. Tahani parsai mishadrei parshadane lahadadi v'lohadri bahu. The Persians, who are his prime example of the Jews, non-Jews of his time. The non-Jews of his time, what do? They send gifts to each other, and they don't renege on their gifts. They'll never, okay? They will never take back a gift. Now, obviously, there was no money passing hands. It was just Mashicha. That means the fact that they never changed their minds about gifts shows that they view that as a complete sale. Now, it's not a sale, but it's like a sale, right? It's a complete transaction. And all that happened there was Mashicha. So there's my proof. Rav Ashi Amar, what are you talking about? Mashicha is not koneh. You're talking about those Persians? Why don't they change their minds? Not because Mashicha for them is the end of the deal. That's the act of acquiring. But now you could translate this, and the Quran they use haughtiness. Haughtiness sounds negative. I would actually think it's more like pride. Okay, they have pride. They said, like, I gave a gift. I'm not going to renege on a gift. It's a matter of pride. Okay, you could call it haughtiness, you could call it pride. Wherever it comes from, positive or negative place, but basically, that's a different reason. It has something to do with acts of acquiring. It's just people don't renege on gifts. Okay, they have a certain amount of, that would be embarrassing for them. Okay, so that's Amemar's proof and Rav Ashi's response. Now we're going to move completely into Rav Ashi. I'm Rav Ashi, mina. Okay, here comes the complicated part. Rav Ashi, and what's complicated about this is we're going to take a scenario where Rav taught the shopkeepers, this is the way you're supposed to sell wine, and only in this way. And then we're going to have two different ways, Rav Ashi's way of reading it, to prove his point, that Mashicha is not koneh in Akum. And then we're going to have a different, the Stama de Gemara. We're going to have this anonymous comments coming to say, oh, I think this could be totally different. And it really all depends on the reality. Remember, I mentioned we get back to, is it the kalim of the Jew? Is it whose jug is it and who's this? And no one really knows the situation in which Rav said this, and they're making up things to try to prove their points. Okay? Also, you could say it was devil's advocacy, right? He's kind of saying, who knows if that's the case? Maybe it could be something else. So it's going to be a complicated back and forth here. So Rav Ashi says, here's my proof. Okay? Rav said to those storekeepers that sold wine, the Jewish ones, when you measure out your wine to idolaters, shiklu zuze minayhu. First take money from them. Okay, you can see why this is. First take the money. And then measure it out. And so much so that if they don't have any money on them, uzfinu, go lend them money right then and there. Get the money back a minute later. And then they'll owe you the money. So if it was $100 for the bottle, have them pay you $100. Lend them $100, they'll pay you the $100, and then they'll owe you $100. But at least the sale will be complete with the transferring of the money. Okay, now. But it's not just that we want to say the money is what's important. We want to say Mashicha wouldn't work. Because listen, he's going to say, De'ilo of Ditu Hachi. Now, Rav said, if you don't do it this way, we're still in Rav. Ki kahave ye nesech b'reshutaychu kahave. V'chishaklitu t'mei ye nesech kashaklitu. Now, if you don't pay the money up front, it will turn into ye nesech in your possession. This is like the issue we discussed in the Mishna. It will become ye nesech first, and then you'll be paying the money for it. Because, right now, let's see what this has to do with Mashicha. Isal kadatach Mashicha bovei kochavim koneh. If we think Mashiach will acquire, turning out Amabed, midemashcha oved kochavim kanye yenesach lo have adinagu. We have stages, right? Now let's put Rav aside. Let's say you didn't pay the money up front, and let's say you pour out the wine. The Gentile takes the wine bottle, pulls it, right? Acquires it. When are they going to do yenesach? After that, and they'll start, futzing around in it, putting their hand in, whatever it is that they do, nesech. So, if Mashicha worked, says Rav Ashi, you wouldn't need to pay the money first. The fact that you need to pay the money first shows that Mashicha doesn't work. That's Rav Ashi. So far, not so complicated. Comes the response. If we're talking about that the Jew puts it in the Jew's jug and then sells, right, the way we buy wine now. We buy wine in a bottle, right? You don't usually bring your own bottles, although I was in a winery where they, if you had your own bottle, you could fill it up from the tap, and it was much cheaper. So sometimes that happens. But if you could fill it up in the Jew's bottle, now we don't know yet why this is an issue. In a minute, you'll see what the issue is. If the Jew fills it up in the Jew's bottle, you're right. Mashicha could be koneh. This is the counter. This is the one that says Mashicha is koneh. And basically, it would be totally fine. Rav didn't say his whole, what he taught these shopkeepers was not relating to a case like that. If it would go in the Jew's bottle, the Gentile takes the bottle, Moshech, it belongs to the Gentile. No problem. Lo tzricha, Rav's teaching that he told them was his suggestion. The Gemara doesn't tell us what the issue here is, but the commentaries explain that what's the issue. Well, you ever have a bottle of wine you finish, right? If you recycle, what you have to do, you usually rinse it out a bunch of times, right? It takes a few times to rinse out to get it really clean. So assuming they didn't rinse out their bottles so much, okay? They also didn't have running water. So any bottle they bring into the Jew store is probably going to have some wine in it, which means what? So now, when does the Mashiach happen at this point? Okay, we're going to change this a little, but right now we assume Mashiach is happening when? After it's filled up, right? So idolater brings in their wine bottle with some of the idolatrous drops at the bottom. Then the Jew pours the wine in. Now we end up with what we call a ta'arovet. We have a mixture of good wine and bad wine. Now it's still in the Jew's possession because there's no Mashiach yet. Non-Jew takes the bottle, pulls it, right? Then acquires it. At that point, it's too late. It's already yayin nesech. We thought the yayin nesech happened, right? Rav Ashi claimed the yayin nesech happened after the Mashiach once became it. Now we see if he brings his own bottle in, then we're going to have a problem. Because then it's going to be yayin nesech even before. Okay? And then the Jew's going to benefit from yayin nesech. So that is why Rav said, again, we have to keep going back. That's why Rav said pay the money first. If you pay the money first, and this sounds like, according to this, Mashiach could be koneh and also money could be koneh. Okay? It's not like one or the other. It sounds like that could solve it or that could solve it. So in this case, the Mashiach is going to be too late because it's already going to be yayin nesech because of the droplets. Okay. So let's pay the money first. Comes Rav Ashi and says, you missed something, which is, okay, there's, besides Mashiach, there's Hagbaha. And Hagbaha is lifting something. Usually you think like, okay, you take an item, you lift it, right? People always do these handkerchief transactions where you lift something. Okay, that's a little different. That I shouldn't confuse that. But you have this idea of lifting something. There's another way that lifting works, and that's called avir. Okay, the air. If it comes into the airspace of something you're holding, then you actually can acquire it that way. So comes Rav Ashi and says, I don't agree with what you're saying. Sof sof kimati la'avira demana kanye. Yenesech lo have ademati la'arita demana. Again, we have to go on a timeline. Rav Ashi is going to prove that Mashiach happens before it becomes yayin nesech. Now, if Mashiach happens before, then again, that goes back to, well, there's no need for the money. And if there's a need for the money, it means Mashiach is not koneh. So, comes Rav Ashi and says, when you pour the wine into the bottle, when does it hit the bottom? After. The first stage is it hits the airspace of the bottle. And now, I'm assuming, we'll get back to this later, maybe they weren't, but assuming the idolater is holding the wine bottle in his hand, the jug, okay? He's holding the jug, and the Jew is pouring. The second it enters the airspace, Kinyan Hagbaha. So if Mashiach would work, like you're claiming, comes Rav Ashi to say, it would be Nimshach, it would be owned by the Gentile before Mashiach. Before it became yayin nesech, and should be a problem. So Rav would have had to give the solution. And that's what Rav Ashi claims. So now, here comes the harder part. Now we're going to have a whole question, and they're going to ask it in a bit of an interesting way. They're going to mention two debates that we don't really have clear-cut issues to, and we're going to say, oh, does it mean that this person who disagreed with Rav Ashi, who we don't have a name for, but whoever disagreed with Rav Ashi, this counter, did they hold by this opinion? Did they hold by this opinion? Because now we're trying to figure out what were they thinking to counter Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi has a good point about this lifting thing. If the idolater was holding it in his hand and the wine poured in, it would immediately be acquired before it got down to the bottom. Because remember, the whole issue, according to this other opinion, is the droplets at the bottom. So the first question is, Shmat mina nitzok chibur? Maybe it's because they held, and is it a kind of a question? Do they hold that nitzok is chibur? What is nitzok chibur? We've seen this a bunch of times. When you're pouring something, there's obviously the whatever you're pouring is connected, right? There's a whole pouring action going on, and the wine at the top is really somewhat connected to the wine at the bottom. Do we view this halachically as connected? Okay, we talked about this with the wine going down with the, right, we talked about it with honey because honey is more thick, okay, but we're talking about wine now. And we talked about it with the wine and the got and going down and where the Gentile got in contact with it. Anyway, we've seen this in a bunch of sugyot. It's a big sugya in Tumantara. Now, the reason why we have to come up with why didn't the counter opinion think that the avir of the vessel, the air, right, when it entered the airspace, it acquired it. So maybe because he held that nitzok is chibur, which means what? When does it hit the droplets? The first ones hit the droplets, right, as it's going down, and becomes yayin nesech. Now, some of it has gone through the airspace first, but most of it is still up above, hasn't even come into the airspace of the vessel. Now, if we view this as one connected thing, then basically we're going to say that all the top part becomes yayin nesech before it gets into the vessel, because it's connected and attached at the bottom. Is that the reason? Okay, that's what they're asking, the counter opinion. To which the Gemara answers, no. Now, I don't think it's the person answering. This is just the Gemara kind of grappling with this approach. But it's unclear who's talking. No. Now, we get back, I said, who says he's holding the kli? It says, so, again, according to the counter opinion number one, we already said it's not the vessel of the Jew. Now we're going to say it's not the vessel of the idolater that the idolater is holding in his hand. If he was holding his hand, you're right, Rav Ashi. Rav wouldn't have needed this solution. So, when does he need it? So he says, right, hachanami lo tzricha demana cha'ara. It must be that, I'm sorry, I didn't read that right. Sorry. If he was holding his hand, you'd be right. Okay? There would be Mashiach, right? Mashiach would be koneh, and it would all happen beforehand, before it gets forbidden. Because I don't think nitzok is chibur. This is what's important to say. I don't believe nitzok is chibur. I don't view the whole thing as connected. But what? I'm talking about a case Rav must have told these people. Again, we don't know what Rav told them in what situation. In a situation where it's on the ground. If it's on the ground, then there's no kinyan hagbaha. Nobody's lifting anything, right? Even though he wasn't lifting it anyway, like lifting weights, he wasn't picking it up, but he was holding it. It went into the airspace, and they may have this law that the avir is a kinyan. Something falling into the airspace of someone holding it works, but not if it's on the ground. Okay, fine. Second question. V'tiknele kilyo, but wait, remember we said chatzer, you could put something in my yard and it'll be mine. You could put something in my vessel, it'll be mine. So, again, and then once it enters the airspace of my vessel, it should be mine before it hits the bottom. So if this vessel belongs to the non-Jew, and the Jew pours into it, okay, but there's one caveat here. It's a vessel of a non-Jew in the property that doesn't belong to him. He's in the store of the Jew. So, you might remember, this is the whole sugya that we learned. There's a machloket about this. Shema Mina came up in Kiddushin, and really the central sugya was also in Bava Metzia. Are we going to derive that this counter opinion must hold that since they're claiming it was on the floor, it was on the ground, and, right, so no one was holding it, and it must be that, if we already said it has to be the vessel of the Gentile, because otherwise there's no issue of yayin nesech at all, there's droplets in the bottom of the Jews, wouldn't be a problem. So maybe this person holds that the kli of the buyer in the property of the seller, okay, this is just any case, it doesn't have to do with Jew, non-Jew. I bring my own vessel into a store and I fill it up with flour, let's say, okay, I'm in one of the stores where they sell flour in the open and I fill up my thing. It's not mine until I walk out of the store. Is it mine once it's in my vessel? Okay, so I'm still in someone else's domain. I'm in the store's domain. So there's a big machloket about this. So is it that this person must hold the kli of the purchaser when they're in the store still is not considered an act of acquiring? And then that would make sense. So then again, this is why, right? Again, if they say that, then again, the whole problem is, even though it was poured into their vessel, it's not acquired yet by them. And if it's not acquired, then they can do yayin nesech while they're sitting in the store. They can turn into nesech, and it's going to be still in the property of the Jew, and then the Jew's going to benefit. They get paid for that wine. So they say, no, just like they didn't think he hold nitzuk was chibur, he didn't necessarily say, they don't necessarily say that this is what he holds about. Lo kana lokech, maybe you can acquire things in your own vessel in the store. Lo lame malacha kana lokech, you could say, and we don't know, we're just suggesting. V'hacha b'mayas kinan, now we're going to change the case, another thing. Okay, so we changed the case, it's not a vessel of a Jew. Again, this is all according to the counter opinion, not Rav Ashi. It wasn't a vessel of a Jew. It was a vessel of a non-Jew. It wasn't in the person's hands. It was on the ground. Now we're going to say something else. And now we thought all along that where are the droplets from the bottle of wine? At the bottom. But now they say, now we thought the whole thing is first it goes into the airspace, then it falls to the bottom. And that's what Rav Ashi was claiming. First there was a kinyan. Now we say, if you hold that the kli of the buyer could acquire even in the store, then it should be acquired. So what do we have to do? We have to find a case where the yayin nesech happened before, the mixture happened before it got into the airspace of the kli. How could that work? Well, if on the top of the rim of the vessel, not inside the airspace, but on the rim of the vessel there were wine droplets. So now imagine what happens. The Jew pours it in. As it goes down, it touches the rim, it brings down the yayin nesech with it. So as soon as it's acquired, it's already yayin nesech. And that must be the issue. So that's the counter opinion. Okay? Now, they're going to ask another question. Uchiman, but wait, who does this go according to? And they're going to bring the different issue. We're almost at the end of this. Delo Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. This must be that this counter opinion doesn't hold like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, because what does Rav Shimon ben Gamliel say? Rav Shimon ben Gamliel ha'amar yimacher kulo lovdei kochavim chutz midmei yayin nesech shebo. Shimon ben Gamliel, okay, talking about the Rishonim coming up with that heter, he came up with a huge heter to this Isra Hana. Specifically in ta'arovot. Ta'arovot is mixtures, right? If you have a little yayin nesech that mixes up with a lot of wine, right, it could be huge financial loss. So Rashbam came up with a solution, which I think we mentioned. This really comes up in Ayin Daled, which we haven't learned yet, but Rashbam says that if you have wine mixed with yayin nesech, you have good wine that got mixed with yayin nesech, and you know how much yayin nesech went in. So you can sell all that wine and just deduct the amount. So instead of selling it for $100, sell it for $95 if it was $5 worth of yayin nesech, and then you're not benefiting from yayin nesech. So you could sell the whole thing. You don't have to say the whole thing is ruined. You can sell it, and just that way you don't get benefit. Now, let's just think about it. Now again, this is the counter opinion of how they understood why Rav said you have to give the money first. Remember, you have to give the money first, because if not, we're going to end up with a problem. You're basically going to be selling yayin nesech. Now, if there's droplets at the top of the rim of this bottle, and they fell into this mixture, the Jew could still sell that according to Rashbag, because the droplets aren't worth anything. And even if they're worth something, so take off a few pennies and you're fine. So he obviously must, right? Why did he insist that they gave the money first, right? Obviously he didn't hold by Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, because according to Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, the storekeepers could sell it anyway, because you just sell it for minus the drops, or maybe the drops really don't even count for anything. So the answer to this is, well, yeah, of course it doesn't hold like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, because this is all an explanation of Rav. And what do we know about Rav? Again, this is all to figure out. It's at least not Rav Ash's explanation, but it's the counter explanation of Rav and what he suggested to the storekeepers. And we already know that Rav doesn't hold like Rashbam, although you'll be confused by what I start reading. But Rav. This counter opinion is just trying to explain Rav. And yeah, Ha'amar Rav, didn't Rav say, Halacha ki Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel? That's why you're going to be confused. The halacha is like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, but not in every case. Chavit bechavit, avalo yayin beyayin. There's two kinds of mixtures you can have. One is you have 8 barrels of kosher wine and 1 barrel of non-kosher wine, and now you don't remember which is which. In that case, Rav holds like Rashbag and says you could sell all 9 barrels for the price of 8. But he doesn't agree when you have 1 jug with yayin nesech mixed up together with regular wine. He doesn't agree that you can do that, and that's our case. So he doesn't hold like Rashbag. So yeah, that's okay. And with that, we're done with the discussion. So this was a back and forth discussion with Rav Ashi and the counter opinion about whether Rav told the storekeepers make sure to get paid first. What was the issue? Because Mashiach is not Koneh, and therefore the wine, according to Rav Ashi, would still be in the possession of the Jew until the money's paid, and therefore pay the money first, because when the non-Jew pulls the wine, it's not yet theirs, which means that if they're nesech a minute later, and then you get paid later, you're going to end up getting paid for yayin nesech. And then we have the counter who says, no, that's not the issue. The issue was the droplets of the wine that got mixed in, and it's only if it's theirs, and it's only if it's on the ground, and it's right, and all those things. And in the end, it's really the problem of the ones that are at the top that fall in. So whether it's being held, whether it's not being held, the truth is that doesn't really matter. But it would have to be that it's the vessels of the idolaters, and then the droplets went in, and that would happen before Mashiach, and that's why Rav said you have to pay. Okay, that was a summary of the complicated part. Now we're going to have three difficulties. The first is a difficulty on a Meitive, who said, we have to remember, Mashiach is Koneh. He's not the one speaking in the counter here, although maybe he is, I don't know, but he's the one who disagrees with Rav Ashi. We learned this, yeah? If you buy all sorts of small coins, but there were all this stuff mixed in, it turns out there were some idols in there. If you hadn't paid the money yet, and you did Mashiach, you can return it. Why? We assume because there was no kinyan yet. Okay, Mashiach is not Koneh. That seems pretty clear. You can just return it and say, okay, I didn't give money, and right, ad shalom natam. I did Mashiach, but it's not mine because Mashiach is not Koneh. But if you first paid the money, and then you did Mashiach and you took it, and then you saw there was Avodah Zarah, you can't return it. It's too late. That's how we're understanding it now. Sounds like it's too late because you paid the money. That sounds like the money is what's Koneh, and Mashiach is not Koneh. Because if you did Mashiach only, you'd be able to return it. So if you thought Mashiach was Koneh, then you shouldn't be able to. Then why should you be able to return it? Two possible answers, although the first one will be rejected. Abaye and Rava. Amar Abaye. Mishum demechse ki mekach ta'ud. He says, no, the reason you can return it is not because Mashiach can be Koneh, but it was a mistaken transaction. You didn't want to buy Avodah Zarah, so you return it. Amar Rava. Wait, that doesn't make any sense. Because there's a Reisha and a Seifa. The beginning says you can return it. The second one says you can't. But they're both mekach ta'ud. Reisha mekach ta'ud, Seifa nami mekach ta'ud. They're both a mistake. Why in the case where you pay the money, you can't return it, and if you didn't pay the money, you can return it? That doesn't make any sense. Ella Amar Rava, Reisha b'Seifa mekach ta'ud. He said they're both mekach ta'ud. You missed the point. There's a totally different issue going on here. Not what we thought. Reisha de lo yahiv zuza lo mechazek avodah zarah b'yad Yisrael. In the Reisha case, what happened? Let's imagine the scenario. I bought this stuff from you, but I didn't pay it. Okay, I buy it from this non-Jew. I didn't pay. When I return it to the non-Jew, what do? I just go back and I say, listen, okay, we made an arrangement for $100 that was going to buy this pile of junk, and stuff. Now, there was $98 worth that was good, $2 worth not good. So I haven't paid you money yet. So here, take back the Avodah Zarah, and when I pay you, I'll pay you $98 instead of $100. What's the safe? So that doesn't look like I'm doing business with Avodah Zarah. But Seifa, de Yahiv Zuze, in the Seifa case, I gave you money, or I gave this non-Jew money. So what happens? I give the non-Jew money. I get my stuff. I see my stuff as a problem. I give back some of it, and I say, give me back my money. Now, if somebody's looking, what does it look like? It looks like I gave them Avodah Zarah, they gave me money. Looks like I'm doing a sale in Avodah Zarah. That's the problem. It has nothing to do with acquiring, not acquiring. It's all a mekach ta'ud. In mekach ta'ud laws, we can return anything because it was a mistake. So even though there was a kinyan and it was all acquired, it's irrelevant because it's a mistake. I theoretically could return in either case. So this doesn't have to do with Mashiach. All it has to do with was the money paid or not, and is money going to go back to me or not? If the money goes back to me, it's going to look like I'm selling you Avodah Zarah. Okay, now we get to the difficulties on Rav Ashi. The first one being from our Mishna. We finally get back and we're going to understand our Mishna properly now. Tashma. Let's learn from our Mishna. So remember, pasak. You made an arrangement for the price, ad shalom adab, before you measured, damav mutalim. Then it works. If Mashiach is not koneh, then you made an arrangement on the price. Then you poured it in. The idolater took it, and then they did yayin nesech. Now there's no kinyan yet. So how could this possibly work? According to you, Mashiach wasn't koneh. If you say Mashiach is koneh, makes perfect sense. They acquired it, and therefore it's okay, because once they turn into yayin nesech, it's in their property. But here, according to you, there's been no kinyan. Pasak is not a kinyan, right? Making an arrangement of how much money, according to you, you have to do something more to do that. Or maybe it is, and that's what we're going to figure out. So he says, Rav Ashi says, there was just some small, minor, or maybe major point missing in the Mishnah. You actually gave some money in the beginning, okay? You made an arrangement of the price, and the idolater gave money, okay? They paid the money. If they gave a dinar, which could have been the whole price, could have been some of it, doesn't matter. They paid money, okay? And that's why. So they paid money. They agreed on the price. Okay, maybe agreed on the price before they paid the money. It doesn't matter. Theoretically, they could have paid before even agreeing on the final price and figure it out later. But money was put down, and that's why it was acquired. And that's why it works. Okay, but what's the problem? We're assuming that the first two cases are parallel, except for the difference between them. What's the difference? Whether you decided how much money was going to be, you gave the non-Jew the price, or you didn't give the non-Jew the price. So why, if you didn't give him the price, does it not work, right? So why, if you measure it out before, if you gave him money before, we're assuming, once you say the first case is that, the second case is that too, he gave him some money up front, which means the kinyan happened. So why would it not be permitted then? So comes Rav Ashi and says, well, how do you explain the Mishnah? You can't explain the Mishnah either. If you think Mashiach is koneh, then same problem, right? The issue is pasak, lo pasak. It's not mashach or not mashach. So amar le'ulididach, amar Mashiach ba'ovei kochavim konah, amar reisha damad mutarim v'sefer damad mutarim. You also don't have a good explanation for the Mishnah. This is why I said the Mishnah doesn't make any sense in terms of Mashiach koneh, kesef koneh. That's not what the issue is. The issue is pasak, not pasak. So comes Rav Ashi and he says, and this is going to explain the Mishnah according to both of them. What can you say? And he's going to say, you'll explain the Mishnah this way, I'll explain it in the same way. Pasak, samchadate. Lo pasak, lo samchadate. It's all about smichut. And this is something we learned when we talked about kinyan. Were you serious about this transaction or not? You can't ever definitively go into a transaction unless you know how much you're paying. That's the theory here. Okay, maybe for something small and not expensive, maybe. But basically, if you don't know what the item costs, even if you put some money down, you're still not showing seriousness of intention, because they might say some insane price. They might say, this isn't a $200 wine bottle, it's a $400 wine bottle, right? We're talking about wine where you really can't tell the difference in price. Wines cost such a different variety of prices. They could give you some crazy price and you'll say, I didn't mean to buy this. And you'll say, give me my dinar back. So that's why in this case, the pasak is what's critical here. Okay? That's what's going to be so now, according to Rav Ashi, it has to be, you need pasak and money transferred. That's why, right? That's why he claims, even though the Mishnah doesn't say it, you gave money. According to the Amemar, the counter opinion, right? The one who doesn't agree that Mashiach is koneh, it's Mashiach and pasak. Okay? And that's the simple reading of the Mishnah. So he says, just like you can only explain the Mishnah that way, hachanami, right? Sorry, I'm just finding the words. Ledidi nami, according to me also, afagav dekadim ledinar, even though he gave him money first, it doesn't matter. You gave a deposit. Pasak samchadate, lo pasak lo samchadate. It's all about deciding on the price. Okay, let's finish up with the last question on Rav Ashi. Amar le Ravina le Rav Ashi tashma. To Amar Rabbi Chia. Bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Noach neharag apacham shavapruta. A ben Noach can get killed if they steal something, even if it's less than a shavapruta. A Jew is only liable for theft if it's a shavapruta. A non-Jew is going to be liable and even killed. This is if those who, right? Ben Noach gets killed for any of the 7 mitzvot Noach laws. V'lo nitan leheshavon, and it can't be returned because there's not enough of a shavapruta. Like there's no. Normally, you steal something, you have to return it. Well, this can't be returned because it doesn't have enough value. It's less than a pruta. Now, Now, the assumption here is in order to be killed, you need to have done something. What does it mean to have done something? To have taken something that wasn't yours, make it yours. Now, how do you make something yours? Well, if Mashiach is koneh, then the non-Jew who stole this item acquired it. And then they've done something wrong, and on that they're getting killed. If they don't acquire it, they haven't done something wrong. It actually still belongs to the Jew, even though it happens to be in their possession. Now, of course, they did do something wrong. We're going to talk about that in a second. But theoretically, halachically, they haven't taken something that's not theirs and made it theirs, because they didn't make it theirs, because Mashiach is not koneh. So that would be a difficulty against Rav Ashi, to which Rav Ashi answers, or someone answers. Yeah, I guess he answers. Mishum ditzare liYisrael. he tortured a Jew by stealing from them. In other words, there's something wrong with stealing that can get you the death penalty. I mean, I know death penalty sounds harsh, but that's because the no chad laws, they're important and they're going to get killed for them. That's a whole different issue. But the point is, he upset the Jew, and on that count, he's getting by stealing. Because basically, it's saying, in other words, it's a terrible thing to steal. Whether it's technically in your possession or not, that's not the issue. Okay, that was the resolution to the second one. So what we do today, we started about the city, and we talked about the difference in the city that the troop that comes into a city, and which wines they ruin, which cases do they ruin wine and not, in contradiction with the issue of the rape. Then we went to the getting paid, and how can you resolve an issue of getting paid in wine? In which cases can you, in which cases can't you? Compared it to the issue of giving taxes on behalf of the Jew. And then we talked about selling, and the whole question of how to sell and when exactly the issue is. We had the Mishna, which then we had to work in with the two different opinions about, is Mashiach koneh for non-Jews or is it not koneh for non-Jews? And then we had the whole back and forth about whether you could learn what you could derive from the story of Rav and what he taught the shopkeepers. And then we had a difficulty against the Maimer and two difficulties against Rav Ashi, and resolved them all. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day. B'sorot tovot. Don't forget to register for the Siyum next week and on September 2nd. And a reminder, upcoming Siyum soon after that, which everything will go out later, but Siyum both live in Jerusalem in Hebrew, but open to everyone who happens to be around, and hoping that people will come from all over. And also the Siyum, the English Siyum on September 14th of all of Seder Nezikin. It's a very big milestone, and our last big Siyum Seder before we have one more, actually just before the Siyum Hashas. But without wishing everyone a good day.